Which one? This one, yeah? Awesome. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for welcoming me so kindly on the stage tonight. I would like to start this talk tonight by addressing the elephant in the room. Many of you are probably sitting there right now and thinking to yourself, why is there a middle-aged, middle-class, white guy standing on this stage talking to us about diversity? You're probably right. But let me ask you this question. How many of you are sitting here tonight, and please feel free to raise your hand and identify yourself as being white? Anybody male? Anybody female? Anybody wearing glasses? How did my questions right now make you feel? Did you feel visible? But let me ask you also this question. Did you have times in your life where you felt invisible? And let me ask you one final question, and that is, imagine that you just did not raise your hand to any of those questions that I asked. How did you feel? Look, I'm someone who stands on this stage and I'm accepted for all of the achievements and privileges that I have garnered in life. And so all of those descriptions that I talked about are probably right. But my story wasn't always the same. You see, I was an 8-year-old boy that was forced to leave the former Yugoslavia. I left with my family, and we left behind everything that we knew that was our comfort. We left behind my father, who was subsequently killed by a neighbor. And for many years hereafter, we kept walking through the world, trying to find shelter, often feeling very invisible, as though we did not matter. You see, by the time I was 15, I had lived in 4 different countries. I had attended 8 different schools. And most of those schools I was bullied at, because I was the other. I was someone who was a refugee, who did not speak the language, who did not have the same culture as the people around me. That is me in this photo on the right-hand side. You can clearly see that I've got blonde hair. Probably not my proudest moment when I think back at it now. But the story behind this photo is that I went to the hairdressers and made an appointment and got my hair colored despite the wishes of my mother. You see, at this time I went to a school where everyone in my school was blonde and blue-eyed. And so this was my desperate attempt to make myself visible. There were so many things that were hidden inside me for many years to come, partly because of my background as being the refugee and the other. I did not allow many of the other things to come to the fore. You see, when you throw more otherness onto the otherness that already exists, that kind of pushes you further into the ground. And so things like my sexuality stayed with me until I was well into my 30s, because I was too afraid to be anything outside of the heteronormative world that I lived in. And unfortunately, through this time, I also had no role models, because most of the people that came from my background were struggling with the same things just like me. As I grew older, I met many people who were struggling in the same way, and many still do. So you see, these narrow representations have the ability to limit human potential through stereotypes and othering. Stereotypes become apparent when a group that seems to share certain characteristics is being made visible. So for example, a group that has everyone in it with blonde hair, or maybe a group that kind of has a bunch of people that dress the same. We can also assume that this group has other characteristics that are the same too, and therefore we might engage and include or exclude them. You see, as humans, we're wired to make snap judgments, and these judgments are based on our biases and limited information that we have at the time. but these biases can also really have harmful consequences. I'll tell you another little story about me, and then I'll finish with the stories about me. There was a time when I finished university and I started applying for jobs. Still being this sort of scared person, trying to sort of get out in the world and be the same as others. But unfortunately, I wasn't. You see, at that time in Australia, it was common practice to throw in the bin resumes that had names that were not necessarily anglicised or sounded a little different to others. And in my case, I sent out 130 applications and received a rejection after rejection. It wasn't until much later in time that a friend of mine who'd seen my struggle pulled me to the side and gave me a job. That gave me my start in life. You see, it took someone to see my invisibility and to make me visible. We see these stereotypes persist in the fashion industry today as well. You see, there are only about 2% of people that look like the models that represent us. In a recent study that looked at stores that included sort of fashion for people and they tried to represent people in fashion, and amongst 20,000 respondents, most of whom were female, they answered that they did not necessarily see themselves represented because of their body shape. You see, this representation is also still very narrow because it only addresses one point of difference. You see, othering is a tool of invisibility and division. When people are being othered, they're labeled as different because they sit outside of the norm of the social group. They're essentially marginalized. It creates an us versus them mentality, dehumanizing people, creating disparities in representation. But othering is also minimized when we actually remember that everyone is a human and has their own very story. The human that is got complex thoughts, emotions, and motivations. Increasing visibility provides benefits that are implicit in addressing diversity. And look, I won't lie to you, I think the modeling in the fashion industry has made some inroads. We are starting to see a little bit of representation come through. But this is why I would like to introduce someone to you. This is Ellie Goldstein. She's a British model. Ellie is the first Down syndrome model that has been taken on by a little unknown brand called Gucci. When Gucci posted a photo of the campaign that they created, this became the most successful campaign they've ever had. It garnered over 800,000 likes upon posting. You see, Ellie was Gucci's first model living with Down syndrome. But this is not surprising, because while disabled people make nearly 24% of all society on Earth, only 0.02% are actually represented. I think it's incumbent upon us to now take a look at maybe a little bit of the history that has preceded this and how representation in fashion and modeling has come to be. You see, back in the 50s and 60s, black women weren't allowed to be on catwalks. It was through a complete accident that someone called Eunice W. Johnson, the founder of Johnson & Johnson and Ebony magazine, started a little roadshow that featured black women. The roadshow came on the back of a campaign, a razor campaign for a hospital. Now, what started then took another 5 or so years before we actually saw black women on stage, but it created one of the largest roadshows that ever existed. You see, While we had some inroads and some waves were made in the early 60s, it still took quite some time before we saw some real representation. And that happened around the time that a little girl was window shopping and being scouted on the streets of London. At the age of 16, this girl appeared on the front cover of the Elle magazine. Her name was something that you might have heard before, and it's called Naomi Campbell. See, what Naomi did at this time is to create visibility for black people. And by the mid-90s, we already saw campaigns that featured only black models. Quite huge strides. But even though we've made a lot of strides, we find ourselves in 2022 where the history also tells us that we're not quite there yet. You see, only 40.2% of models who walked the runway during Fashion Month in 2020 were people of color. In 21, only 5 people of fashion magazine covers worldwide featured Black, Asian, Hispanic, or Middle Eastern models. 78.2% of models who walked the runways during the New York Fashion Week were white. But I stand also here to tell you that the future can be different. We've seen by the examples of Naomi Campbell and Ellie Goldstein that representation could lead to long-term change. I would like you all to close your eyes now and imagine a future. Imagine a future in which diverse, multifaceted roles exist for all people. A future in which, in the modeling industry, that supports all types of beauty, positive role models in life, like this. You see, Maria Montessori, way before the 50s and 60s, when we started to look for visibility, was already out there trying to promote how we actually engage as a society. She talked about peace as something that needs to be educated. She talked about us not needing to educate for competition, but really finding that solidarity in our own humanity, and that is when we start teaching for peace. Acceptance and solidarity is what creates visibility, allowing for people to no longer have to hide and compete for something that they're not, allowing for everyone to be seen. Everyone here, all of us in this room, we're a generation of underrepresentation, but we firmly hold the tools to make a change. And I can tell you that brands are ready. We've seen many of the bigger brands start to engage with diversity. And we've seen a lot of smaller brands still wanting to engage and sometimes not knowing how. It might take us some time, but I think together we can make a difference. I want to leave you tonight with 3 points. And these are that, in summary of what I've just talked. And that is that we all have a unique story. And stories are what makes us human. Making our stories more visible allows us to embrace humanity. Othering is a tool of division. By embracing our diversity, we can ensure that everyone is visible. And also that while there have been some strides to improve diversity, history may not have been so kind in enabling visibility. But we firmly hold the tools in our hands to ensure that future generations see themselves represented and are thereby made visible. I have made it my work now to broaden representation in fashion, but everyone can participate. We all have access to social media and to a lot of the tools that can enable us to really present our true selves. So it is incumbent upon us to also do that. I would like to invite you all tonight to celebrate beauty and diversity in beauty, and to move closer to make the invisible visible. Thank you very much.